Okay, now he died eventually, but did he leave a dynasty of some sort? I mean, how did this happen?
Well, he left 5 sons who were very well trained by this man, who by that time had become the outstanding money lender of Europe due to a very peculiar circumstance. King George III and the Bank of England wanted to punish the American colonists for being so obstreperous and for refusing to give all of their profits to the Bank of England from their income. And so when they rebelled, then the British Army did not really want to fight their American cousins. So King George said, well, I've got to get somebody else to fight this war. I need some mercenaries, some hired soldiers. And over in Germany, the Elector of Hesse, a German province, had a very well-trained group of soldiers called the Hessians. And so he said, well, I'll rent these out to you, King George, who was a German himself, by the way, of Hanover. And he said, for $5 million, you can have this nice army. And so George said, all right. And then when the Elector of Hesse got this $5 million, he said, what am I going to do with it? And they said, well, there's a very good investor and financial advisor named Meyer Amschel Rothschild there in Frankfurt. So he let Meyer Amschel lend out this money, which was the biggest chunk of capital in Europe at that time, $5 million. And so Amschel spread it around, and pretty soon he brought back $20 million to the elector, who was very pleased, and kept $5 million for his efforts. So now he was a monetary power himself, and of course the Elector of Hesse let it be known that if you had money to invest, put it in Meyer Amschel's hands. So when Meyer died, he had 5 sons, and so they dispersed themselves over the 5 capitals of Europe. And Nathan went to London, James went to Paris, and so forth. So they now had total control of the monetary resources of Western civilization, the entire continent of Europe. And they had developed some very interesting techniques. One was that the courier went from James in Paris to Nathan Mayer in London, and he wanted $1 million in gold. So he would give him a note saying, I want $1 million in gold, but he would not sign it. So if someone came into a Rothschild office, a courier and said, I have a request here for $1 million, it's signed James Rothschild, and Nathan knew it was fake because they didn't sign their communications.
Little trickery even then, but I think good little trickery.
Well, you live and learn, you know.
That's right. So we're talking about the New World Order. In the New World Order, we had the war with England, and that was the Revolutionary War. And there was the banking system that was set up, and that was Alexander Hamilton that set it up originally after that. Thomas Jefferson then went ahead and decided this was not good for the American people. And then after that, we had the War of 1812, and then we come to Andrew Jackson, and he fought the bankers again, and then we have the Rothschilds, and their dynasty is building. Tell us about the Rothschilds now, how they enter into the picture as far as, shall we say, the Federal Reserve is concerned.
Well, the Rothschilds realized early on you don't make any money by lending somebody $200 to buy a used car. They only dealt with governments and with the kings of Europe, and they only handled government loans because that's where the big money was. And you see, they realized it was a sure thing because if you lent money to a government and they didn't repay you, then they would never get any more money. And they always needed money for wars and for to build Versailles and so forth. To be a king means you spend a lot of money. You're a big spender. And they could always tax their people enough to repay the Rothschilds their money, so they had nothing to worry about. And so by 1880, the Rothschilds really owned all of Europe, and they owned a large part of the United States secretly because they always advertised and promoted the idea that the Rothschilds had no activities in the United States, and they did not because they worked through August Belmont, who was their named representative, and they also worked through J.P. Morgan and Kuhn Loeb Company, which were their secret representatives. And by 1896, these 2 Rothschild firms, J.P. Morgan and Kuhn Loeb, owned 96% of all the railroad mileage in the United States.
Wow, talk about a monopoly there.
And that's in congressional reports. I got that right out of, most of my work, by the way, comes from congressional reports.
So you do researching on congressional reports, and how far do you back to this research information go, Eustace?
About 5,000 years.
5,000 years. We're talking to Eustace Mullins, ladies and gentlemen, and we're talking about the New World Order. Well, tell us then, the Rothschilds, tell us about the Federal Reserve. Now they've become involved in the Federal Reserve, and what about Soviet Russia? How did Soviet Russia come into this New World Order situation, Mr. Mullins?
Well, Soviet Russia was always part of the world order, and in fact the Soviet Empire, the evil empire, which we heard so much about, and in the 1950s we were digging atom bomb shelters in our backyards to protect us from this catastrophe which was going to happen at any moment, and which was good for the contracting industry, but it didn't really help anybody as far as avoiding atomic bombs. So the Soviet Empire came about because of greed and envy. Now, communism, of course, is based on hatred, greed, and envy. But what people don't realize is that the Russian Revolution came about because of the greed and envy of King George V of England for his cousin, Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, who happened to be the richest man in the world. And when you're the richest man in the world, the consequence is all the people who are not quite as rich hate you and wish they could get their hands on your money. So the Rothschilds told King George V, they were all around him as his advisors in London, they said, look, let's go after Nick and get his dough. And George said, well, I'm game. And so the Rothschilds started the communist movement in Russia. And so they murdered the Tsar and his family and took his gold, which was sent to Paris and to Kuhn Loeb Company in New York and the other Rothschild offices, London and so forth. And some of this money, by the way, these Rothschild banks used to buy the original stock of the Federal Reserve System in 1914. That was all bought with the Tsar's money, and so the Romanov heirs, such as are still alive, are the real owners of our Federal Reserve System. And so, as I say, they murdered the richest man in the world, took all of his money. Well,
what year was that, by the way? What year was that when they murdered the Tsar?
Well, that was 1918. They had the Communist Revolution in 1917, and the first thing they did was go in and loot the whole country. They took all the money, and so the result was the new Soviet Empire had no operating capital, and they couldn't tax anybody because they had murdered all the people who owned anything. So you couldn't go out and tax the peasants to keep the country running. So they sent up cries of anguish, and people all over the world responded. Woodrow Wilson, our president, he made a speech to Congress in which he said, it is our duty to help these noble murderers in Moscow, in so many words. And so he first sent them $25 million of his personal war fund, voted to him by Congress to prosecute World War I. And he sent Elihu Root, who, by the way, wrote the charters of all the major foundations. Elihu Root was a lawyer of whom J.P. Morgan said, when I call in lawyers and I want something done, they give me a lot of reasons why it cannot be done. He said, when I call in Elihu Root says, what do you want me to do? And I tell him, and he does it. So that's why he became the lawyer for the big bankers in this country.
Now, tell me, Eustace, because there's a lot of people that have said that the banking themselves, that the communist revolution was started on Wall Street. Is that a true fact or not, Eustace Mullins?